And welcome to Parasha Devarim, and this is the last of the 5 books of Moses. And in this last book, we basically review the whole of the history of the Jewish people as they left Egypt until they arrived at the Jewish promised land of Israel. And the Alshech says that really everybody yearns to have dvikut, connection with our soul to God. And the way he says to do that is through the merit of learning the Torah and also the good deeds that we do. So basically, Parasha Devarim and the whole of the book is basically a review of the stories and the halachot that we received from a perspective of hindsight. What can we learn from those stories that we didn't understand when we read it at the first time? It's almost like a forensic dissection of the stories to reveal the hidden meanings to us and the lessons for us today. So let's have a go. And we notice that we start with basically very subtle admonitions. Instead of Moshe criticizing the Jewish people, he basically goes through the lists of locations where we made certain mistakes in the hope that we will understand these mistakes and correct them in the future. And you'll notice several things. Firstly, it starts gently and then escalates to a statement that you were obstinate. And also you'll notice that the recollection of the events is not in chronological order, because this is not a history book, but really a lesson. And that is why the story of the spies is mentioned first, because this is probably the worst error that the Jewish people made. And we'll see in a moment why. And you'll also notice that certain events and locations are omitted. For example, the descent at the splitting of the sea, of the Sea of Reeds, is not mentioned because it was not expected that the Jewish people will have attained the level of trust in God that would have been required at that stage. And so that's not mentioned. Likewise, any of the events in which Moshe himself received an angry rebuke from God is also not mentioned, because it wouldn't be correct for a teacher to bring up events where he himself was subject to the anger of God. And finally, only events involving the whole nation is brought up, and not events that only a small minority of the nation partook in. And the whole point of admonition is to create a sense of remorse and regret, and a commitment not to do that error again going forward. And so a major lesson to us when we're giving admonition to our children, for example, is that we should only give it when the recipient is in a position ready to hear it, ready to be reminded of the events that caused the errors. Because if the people are going to take offense from the admonition, then the whole purpose of the criticism becomes counterproductive, because ultimately what you want to do is to achieve a sense of remorse and regret, and not to offend their egos. And therefore the person who's giving admonition has to be really careful and take these factors into account. And why do we hear this admonition now, some 40 years after the actual events happen? And the Alshech quotes Avodah Zarah 5, when he says that the student cannot fully understand the teacher until he's learned with him for 40 years. And Moshe spoke to the children of Israel according to everything that Hashem commanded him to say to them, suggests that it's only now, after 40 years, that the Jewish people can really comprehend totally what God translated to Moshe at Mount Sinai. And possibly the Alshech suggests that one of the reasons why this part of the oral law is delayed for 40 years is that God wanted the Bnei Israel to have conquered the lands of Sichon and Og before embarking on this recount of the oral law. Because after the conquest of Sichon and Og, the Bnei Israel, having accepted that God's assistance in conquering those lands, they'd be more receptive to receiving and accepting the parts of the oral law that would be more difficult for the ear to hear otherwise. And it's very interesting, in verse 6, Hashem says, "Enough of your dwelling by this mountain, turn yourselves around and journey, and come to the Amorite mountain." And verse 8, "See, I've given you the land before you. Come and possess the land that Hashem has sworn to your forefathers to Avraham, to Yitzchak and Yaakov, to give to them and to their children after them. We have to constantly be aware that we're in motion towards our end destination, and so we cannot stay in too long in one place because we would just stagnate, however good that place might be. And make no mistakes about it, they had it great in Mount Sinai, in the desert generally. They had the man, they had the water, they had everything at their fingertips. They didn't have to work. Everything was provided by God. And so to preempt the idea of, God, why would you want us to leave this beautiful place, this beautiful existence, and move to Canaan? Moshe says to them, only in the land of Israel can God truly become your God. And this is echoed in Ketuvot 111, which says that anyone lives outside Israel, it's as if he does not have a God. And God is saying, I know that you're staying by the mountain is important, but you being in the land of Israel is even more important. Therefore, turn around and move. In other words, move your mental attitude towards the land. And the Alshech spends some time to reinforce this idea that Jews that live in the diaspora are not really living to their true, full life mission. They're never really at home. And this is supported by the whole idea of Lech Lecha for Avraham. Go for yourself to the land that I will show you, because only there can you find your true self. And Moshe reinforces the fact that God has given us this land out of chesed, and so there's nothing to fear about taking possession of it. And in verse 8, when God talks about the fact that he gave it to Avram, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov, the Vav, Yaakov, is significant. He's saying that each of the Avot has a midah, an attribute. Avram is chesed, kindness, Yitzchak is din, judgment, and Yaakov is rachamim, compassion. And very interestingly, the Alshech says that God promised the land to Avraham and Yaakov. Yitzchak, on the other hand, just received it on the merit of the fact that he was the son of Avraham. And therefore, he uses this as a proof to show that the land has been given out of chesed and not out of din. This is important because the ramifications of something being received out of kindness is that you don't need to fear it when you take possession of it. And I have to confess that when I'm reading the sin of the spies, it's very painful to me because as the Alshech says, when the king gives you a gift, you should be grateful for it. And the criticism of the Jewish people is that not only were they not grateful for it, they did not even acknowledge it as a gift. In verses 19 and 21, we get the description of how quickly God moved the Jewish people from the Mount Sinai to the edge of the land of Israel. This was a proof that God was going to do everything he could to make the possession easy and fluid and with ease. And the use of re'eh in verse 21, see, in the singular, is an indication that the Jewish people did in fact come to the edge of the land of Israel as a unified force ready to conquer it. And the sentence at the end of 21 is very telling. It says, go up and possess as Hashem, your God, your Father, has spoken to you. Do not fear and do not lose resolve. In other words, all you had to do was just turn up and enter it. Hashem would have done the rest. And unfortunately, the negative attitude towards the land was very indicative of the fact that the Jewish people suddenly allowed fear to take hold of them and failed to acknowledge the great opportunity that was presented before them. And this goes to show that fear is our greatest enemy in all our endeavors. And when we have bitachon, we have conviction that God is on our side and helping us, there is no need to fear. And as a post of this dissection, Moshe finally hints to us how he was fooled by the Jewish people in making him feel that sending the spies was a good idea, as it says in verse 23, and it was good in my eyes. Ve'itav hadavar be'enai. So how did they do it? The answer lies in verse 22 when it says, all of you approached me. V'tikrevun alai kulchem. Moshe is accusing the Jewish people of presenting the request of the spies to go to Israel to spy the land as an innocent mission. And this perception of innocence was compounded by the fact that the Jewish people offered to take the anashim, the important people, as spies, because you wouldn't otherwise have wanted to risk people of stature to go into the land if you didn't have full confidence in God. And Moshe admits that it did not occur to him that the whole nation would stand up against him in this pretense of innocence. And in verse 22, when it says, "Let us send ahead of us the spies," implying that we will follow straight afterwards, was just a bluff. And the truth is given in verse 26 when it says, "You did not wish to ascend, and you rebelled against the word of Hashem your God. You slandered in your tents, and you said, because of Hashem's hatred of us did he take us out of the land of Egypt." I mean, just incredible thoughts. How can they possibly conceive that God would hate them to deliver us to the hand of the Amorites? And then 29, Moshe counters this, which we didn't see in the original text, but here he says, in verse 29, Moshe counters this, but says, "Then I said to you, do not be broken, do not fear them. Hashem your God who goes before you, he will make the war for you, like everything he did for you in Egypt from before your eyes. And in the wilderness, as you have seen, that Hashem your God bore you as a man carries a son on the entire way that you traveled until you arrived at the place." And verse 32, "Yet in this manner you did not believe in Hashem your God, who goes before you on the way to seek out the place for you to camp, the fire by night, and to show you the road that you should travel to with a cloud of day." And this, the Alshech is suggesting, is that this is Hashem, who is the King of Kings, is actually acting like a servant to the Jewish people. What does the servant do? He goes in front of the master, prepares the way, clears the path, makes sure there's light and there's food and there's warmth for the master. And this is what God did to the Jewish people. And instead of appreciating him, they felt unworthy of this incredible gift of chesed from God, and therefore conjectured in their mind somehow that God, instead of God loving them, he hated them. It is really puzzling and saddening to feel today, as we read this text, how the Jewish people actually allow themselves to be manipulated by these warped thoughts that the evil urge put in their hearts. And why? Because it was more comfortable to stay in the arms of Hashem in the desert where everything is being provided for, rather than going into the land and having to descend to the real world, where it's much more difficult to cling to the vikut, attachment of God and complete belief in him, when you're living life in a more physical entity. In other words, it's easy for you to believe in God when you're an angel because you see everything in front of you clearly. No challenges. The Yetzer Hara has no grip on you. Everything is provided for by God. But when you descend into the world where that is not the case, and you have to fight the evil urge, and you have to bring the light of Godness into the darkness of the world, that is exactly where the true dvikud, the true clinging to Hashem is manifested. And Moshe accuses the people clearly of not wanting to go into the land of Israel, and this is shown by the fact that they listen to the majority view of the spies and not to the minority. And this teaching is very important. It means that we have to always, when we're faced with challenges, as we always are in the world, when we're faced with challenges, to look inside and connect with our soul's true purpose and answer to help us to decide who to follow, even if it's a minority view. If it's connected and linked with our soul mission, then that's the view we have to follow. And it's very interesting in verse 34, Hashem heard the sound of your words. Vayishma Adonai et kol divrechem. And this is to mean that God only punishes us for the spoken words and not the unspoken thoughts. Because in Parasha Shelach it says Hashem said that the children would inherit the land that the older generation despised. Now we were never heard that the older generation despised the land. This is clearly God reacting to understanding the unspoken thoughts of the Jewish people. But he only punishes us for the actual words that we said. And the bottom line to all of this is how important it is not to say Lashon Hara on the land, this beautiful, special land that God has given us as an inheritance. No matter what we feel about the politics, about the people, about the situation here, we should never talk badly about the land, because it's the bad talking that produces the lack of appreciation of the incredible gift that God has given us. We have to remind ourselves daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly what a gift it is for us to live here in this land. You know, the sages of old, the Baal Shem Tov, of Nachman of Breslev, these sages spend months and tremendous effort just to try to put their feet on this land, let alone live here. And we have the privilege of all the generations to actually live and enjoy the joy of this land. And so I urge us all to stop talking badly about it and really focus on all the blessings that are so clearly visible to us. And two very interesting ideas about the consequences of this. God actually uses an oath to assure everybody that the old generation would not enter the land. And he uses this oath, the Alshech says, because he didn't want the attribute of justice to later on come in and make the situation worse. He didn't want the attribute of justice to intensify the degree. And it's fascinating, verse 39, it says, "As for your small children, of whom you said they will be taken captive, your innocent children in the presence of whom you said this statement, they themselves, they will be the ones that will come, and they shall possess it as an inheritance." And God assures them that the children of that generation will possess the land as an inheritance. And what is the difference between an inheritance and a gift? A gift can be taken back at any time. An inheritance is irrevocable, and that is the land of Israel for us. Irrevocably ours as an inheritance to always cherish and to enjoy and to use that special energy to connect more deeply with God in a way that we could never possibly do when we're outside Israel. And it's very revealing, this sentence of 41. They said, "We have sinned against God, and we should go up and do the battle according to everything that God has commanded us." But the problem is that God never commanded them to battle. It was going to be given as an inherited possession without the need of us fighting. And so the very statement, "Let us go and fight," we've made a mistake, let us go and fight, is very revealing of the fact that they still, even then, were of the opinion that they had to fight in order to get the land. And there is a key lesson for us here, because the Alshech says if we intended to soften God's attitude towards us, we should have pleaded with him rather than stating that we're going to go and fight before humbling ourselves to Hashem. And the Alshech suggests that it was sinful for us to assume that we would have to fight in order to take possession of the land. It was sinful that the inheritance of the land would have been dependent on the sword. And it's at that point that we transformed our self-sin from an unintentional sin of shogeg to an intentional sin of mazid. And the Deuteronomy chapter 1:8 reinforces it. Go and take possession. There's no need to fight. And in verse 45, when it says, "Then you retreated and you wept before Hashem, but Hashem did not listen to you, to your voice, and he did not hearken to you." And the Alshech says that although we cried, this was not a cry of remorse. This was, again, a cry of fear, a fear for our future, as we cried when we heard the negative reports of the majority of the spies that came back. And again, a great, beautiful lesson for us. God does not listen to our cries of fear, only to our cries of remorse. And for this, we need humbling ourselves, admitting the sin, and doing teshuvah fully. Then our cries will be heard. And now let's turn to chapter 3, verse 2, where it says, we approached Og, and God says to Moshe, "Don't be afraid. Al tira oto." What was it about Og that made Moshe afraid? And the Alshech said there were two things. Firstly, Og was reported to have been a servant of Avraham, Avinu, and secondly, he was reported to have been circumcised because he was a servant of Abraham. And the Jewish people in their battalion and forces at that moment in time were not circumcised. And for those two reasons, Moshe was afraid, and God says, don't worry, I'll bring him into your hands. And in verse 18 it says, Chalutzim ta'avru lifnei achichem, bnei Yisrael, kol bnei chayil. And the Alshech asks, if it is indeed the case, as we have seen, that Moshe has unequivocally explained to us that God will do the fighting for us, why would Moshe spend so much time and effort persuading the tribes of Reuven, Gad, and Manasseh to actually go across the Jordan River and to fight with the rest of the tribes? Not only that, why would he instruct Joshua to come into army formation and to give him strength and to be courageous? And Moshe is suggesting that even though it is God who's fighting for us, we still have to cross the River Jordan and to present ourselves in battle formation in order for that miracle to occur. And the true credit for the victory belongs to God. Well, that's it for the Parasha Devarim, and I have to say that I now understand that why in preparation for Shavuot we're asked to read from specifically from Devarim onward, because this reflection on our journey from Egypt to the land of Israel is so revealing of so many secrets and wisdom as to how to approach life. And the key point is not to be in a state of fear. And this is my blessing to you this week, that whatever challenges we may be faced, whatever darkness may come towards us, may we have the merit to just close our eyes, visualize the connection between our soul and Hashem, visualize the great kindness that He always bestows upon us and will continue to do so. All we have to do is to turn up and take possession of the gifts that He is waiting for us. And the only thing stopping us from doing that is our own fear. So let go of our fears and embrace full-heartedly the conviction that God loves us and wants only the best for us. May you have a blessed week. Shabbat Shalom. See you next week.